And as you can see from the screen, my new book is Becoming Vancouver, a history. I should mention that the cover is a painting by Jack Shadbolt called Granville at Night, painted in 1946. The book itself is a narrative account of the story of the city from the arrival of the first explorers in 1792 to its creation in 1886, and all the way down to the present day. Naturally, this includes a discussion of the First Nations people who occupied the site for many, many, many years before outsiders arrived. It's been several decades since a book like this has appeared. During that time, there have been many books written about different aspects of the city's past, some of its entertainment history, some of its built heritage, its ethnic communities. But I thought perhaps the time had come where to try and bring some of this new material together in a new synthesis. So tonight I want to talk about just one part of the story, in particular, a period when sudden, quite dramatic changes happened in the city, the 1960s to the 1980s. For many of us, certainly for myself, that means I'll be talking about things that happened in our lifetime. So I'm very conscious that I'm talking to the worst possible audience for a historian. That is the audience that may know more about the subject than I do. But nonetheless, let's get at it and see what happens. In the 1950s, where I'll begin, Vancouver was a city very unhappy with itself. Many people decided it needed a bit of a makeover. It was feeling a bit run down, like it had let itself go. The downtown seemed dowdy. The old wooden buildings in the city core were fading and dilapidated. Much of the housing stock was aged and ramshackle. False Creek, the industrial heart of the city, was, in the words of one local politician, nothing but a filthy ditch. Much of the time, a noxious fog obscured the view. Harlan Bartholomew and Associates, the well-known consultants who had prepared an influential 1929 plan for the city, were invited to submit a series of post-war updates. And in them, they lamented the city's rundown appearance as, quote, an affront to the beauty of its natural setting. The man-made city appears sordid and ugly, they complained, with a barren, awkward, frontier-like appearance. The soon-to-be famous architect, Arthur Erickson, said it looked a bit like a shantytown. So the big project for the city in the 1950s was to modernize, to rebuild, to renew itself. This was not unique, of course, to Vancouver at this time. Across North America and in Europe, large cities were embarking on big renewal schemes coming out of the war, which usually meant bulldozing the homes of the less well-to-do and building vast new apartment complexes and roadways in their place. Toronto, New York, of course, where we think of Robert Moses, the buildings are there. London, where I read recently that more buildings were destroyed by redevelopers during the 50s and 60s than were destroyed by German bombers during the Blitz. In other words, Vancouver was very, very much following a national and international pattern. The rebuilding of Strathcona in the 1960s and the Great Freeway debate of 1967 are often remembered as the epitome of post-war renewal in Vancouver. These projects, if they'd gone ahead, would have destroyed much of Chinatown, much of Gastown, leveled Strathcona, and transformed the downtown waterfront. We'll get to that in a moment, but renewal happened in different ways in different parts of the city, and other iconic neighborhoods were also swept up in the enthusiasm for redevelopment. This is an aerial shot of the West End in 1952. You'll note, obviously, that there's not one high-rise in the photograph. The Vancouver Hotel and the Marine Building, you can see a bit right of center, out towards the inlet, are the only tall buildings to be seen in the photo. The West End at this time was a neighborhood of older homes, many of them subdivided into apartments, and low-rise apartment buildings, like this one, the Manhattan, at the corner of Robson and Thurlow, erected in 1908, the first apartment building in the West End, and of course, still standing today. Then in 1956, the city lifted a 6-story height restriction on buildings in the West End. In part, this was a response to the flight to the suburbs and a fear that the downtown was being kind of drained of its economic vitality. So the idea was to densify a neighborhood that was close to downtown and provide people with residences close to work and close to shopping in the hopes of revitalizing the business district. And it worked. Here's a picture of, from 1961 of the West End skyline, and you can see that the first high rises have begun to appear. By the mid-60s, about 40% of all the apartments in the city were contained in this one small neighborhood, the West End. Between 56 and 76, a 20-year period, developers constructed 181 residential towers, that is, buildings that were between 10 and 32 stories, which is about when the city imposed restrictions to end the boom, worried that the increased density was creating problems of its own, overcrowding, increased traffic, and so on. So that now we have this, the West End most of us are familiar with today. Another area that was transforming at this time was the sort of north end of the West End, the Cole Harbour area. From the 1920s, Cole Harbour developed into one of the city's major industrial centers, particularly related to the marine industries. So engine works, boat building yards, and so on. And at least one large sawmill, the Pacific Coast Lumber Mill, shown here. This is what Cole Harbour looked like in 1925. You could get a sense of the extent of the industrial activity and the kind it was. By the 1950s, most of the industries had closed or moved off, and the area, attractive for being close to the entrance to Stanley Park, that of course is Stanley Park in the background, started cleaning up its shoreline and converting it to non-industrial uses. The harbinger of this change was the Bayshore Hotel, I guess officially the Bayshore Inn, which was opened along the shorefront in 1961. The luxurious hotel presaged the transformation of Cole Harbour from a working waterfront to a recreational playground, as more of the shoreline was occupied by things like restaurants, residential towers, parks. And in many ways, it reflected the whole transformation of the city's economy in the same direction during this period I'm talking about. Another neighborhood that was undergoing dramatic changes in the 50s was Strathcona. Again, it was argued that this part of the city, the residential area to the east of Chinatown, had been allowed to become run down. Civic politicians and planners responded to this state of affairs by proposing to destroy the neighborhood, or at least part of it. In 1950, a sociologist at UBC named Leonard Marsh, this is he here, published a report based on interviews carried out by students at the university's School of Social Work. Marsh was one of the most influential thinkers in Canada at the time. Based at McGill during the Depression, he was a founding member of the League for Social Reconstruction and the group of leftist intellectuals who provided the CCF, now NDP, with its intellectual framework. During the war, he authored a report on Social Security, which was in many ways formed the foundation of the welfare state. During the war, Marsh had moved out to UBC, and his report on the inner city, titled Rebuilding a Neighborhood, embodied what at the time were considered progressive views about urban renewal. He recommended the replacement of many of the aging single-family homes in Strathcona with a planned neighborhood featuring clusters of high-density rental housing projects. His report was taken up by the city's planning department, which had recently been created to replace the Advisory Town Planning Commission. It was led by a 41-year-old Englishman named Gerald Sutton Brown, who was hired as the first director of planning. Brown was a self-confident professional who came to enjoy inordinate power in the city. Sutton Power's department endorsed the Marsh plan, even though the majority of residents of Strathcona had said they didn't want to leave their homes, and the Strathcona redevelopment project began in 1959. It was conceived in 3 phases and was 50% funded by the federal government. It began with the construction of a 9-story apartment building on top of McLean Park. This is the site here. Many of the residents, and that's a architect's drawing of what the site would look like. Many of the residents of Strathcona were Chinese Canadian, and even before the start of construction, they had organized in opposition to the project, forming the Chinatown Property Owners Association. But by and large, people in the rest of the city couldn't understand what residents were complaining about. This was progress, and progress required the destruction of the community. For example, the province newspaper wrote that slum clearance is Chinatown's opportunity. Central Mortgage and Housing and the city were partners in the project, and they released a remarkable film extolling the benefits of slum clearance. It was called To Build a Better City, and I urge you to look it up on YouTube where you can view it. And what's mainly remarkable to me about the film is the language that was used to describe Strathcona. It's sort of the language of pathology. The neighborhood was portrayed as a diseased part of the city, a dying area that had to be cut out, much like excising a tumor or cutting off a gangrenous limb, in order to restore the city to health. Clearance was presented as a natural, healthy process by which a city kind of renewed itself. It was also presented as a scientific process. Experts had studied the area, and the experts knew best. So the complaints of Strathcona were dismissed. The redevelopment must go ahead, proclaimed Mayor Tom Alsbury. It was assumed, wrote the urban geographer Walter Hardwick, that no one in his right mind would oppose urban renewal. Accordingly, several more blocks of Strathcona were cleared of houses, and 2 more high-rise developments went up. Thousands of houses were removed in the early 60s, and it wasn't until the late 60s that a coalition of residents, heritage advocates, and social activists managed to mobilize public opinion against the further destruction of the East End. Which brings us to the Great Freeway debate. In the summer of 1967, the city government suddenly announced plans without any public consultation whatsoever to build an elevated freeway through the heart of Chinatown. The intention was to relieve traffic congestion, which was considered to be a major problem, but the plan required the destruction, as I've mentioned, of large parts of downtown. Vancouver was not unique in this either. Urban freeway building was all the rage at this time. One thinks of Seattle, New York, Toronto, many other cities. This photo shows the Georgia Viaduct under construction. The viaduct was part of the scheme, And the photo gives an idea of how destructive the plans would have been if they'd gone ahead. The leading proponents of the plan were the mayor, Tom Campbell. If you lived in the city at the time, you'll remember Tom Terrific, and his top bureaucrat, Sutton Brown. Campbell, shown here with Tom Alsbury, Campbell on the left, of course, had been elected the previous December, that is December of 1966. A very controversial mayor, mainly because of his outspoken opposition to the youth counterculture and his steadfast support for many big development projects, as this iconic photograph of him suggests. He was very plain-spoken, unusual for a politician, and he was not afraid to express in often colorful language his disdain for the hippies, for left-wingers, really for anyone who opposed his ideas for the city. He called opposition to the Chinatown freeway a tempest in a Chinese teapot, and he once called opponents of his other schemes Maoists, communists, pinkos, left-wingers, and hamburgers. Hamburgers, he explained, being people without university degrees. He was mayor for 6 years, 1966 to 72, and it was a very exciting time in local politics. The outcry against the freeway was immediate, not only from the Chinese community, also from business groups, tourist associations, heritage advocates, all of whom objected to the wholesale destruction of historic neighborhoods downtown. There were a couple of public meetings that fall that grew very heated. During one, Mayor Campbell and his councillors walked out, the mayor characterizing it as a near riot. At the second meeting, Peter Oberlander provided the most drama. He was a UBC planning professor and at that point, chair of the Town Planning Commission, who first of all at that meeting read a brief from the commission supporting the city's plans and then resigning on the spot because of his own personal opposition to the freeway. The city promised to take all this criticism under advisement, but in 1968, council announced the freeway was going ahead on the planned route down Carroll Street. Campbell and his planners had completely failed to appreciate how deeply rooted the opposition to these plans were. Partly this had to do with the changing image of Chinatown in the civic imagination, I think. For decades, the white majority had feared Chinatown as the center of crime and drug use, a sort of ethnic ghetto that required cleaning up by urban renewal. This image from 1904 reflects an exoticized Chinatown. But this attitude had changed by the 1960s, and the neighborhood had evolved into a major attraction that gave the city much of its color and romance, in the words of one province reporter, not to mention producing much of its tourist revenue. Chinatown was now celebrated as one of the city's prime assets, not to be destroyed by the schemes of developers and planners. So early in 1968, in the face of continued outcry, council reversed its decision for the time being. But even when the proposal to gut Chinatown was killed, planners came up with another scheme to route the freeway around downtown by building along the north side of False Creek over to Thurlow in the West End, and then digging a tunnel under Thurlow that would swing north to Burrard Inlet and continue across the inlet as a tunnel or emerge onto a new third bridge to the North Shore. When this plan, in its turn, became public, it had been developed by city planners in secret. When it became public in 1971, opponents once again rallied against it, this time to demand a public vote. This, by the way, is when Mayor Campbell called his opponents Maoists, communists, pinkos, left-wingers, and hamburgers. There was another marathon meeting in March 1972, and the upshot was both the provincial and federal governments had had enough. Ottawa withdrew its funding for the project, and later in the year, a new NDP provincial government was elected, and it introduced the C-Bus passenger ferry as an alternative to another bridge. This is a photo of the first C-Bus in operation, and I too was surprised to learn that its first color was orange. Enthusiasm for a third crossing along with a downtown freeway to feed into it sort of faded away. Ultimately, the various freeway plans were defeated. The Georgia Viaduct was the only part of the freeway project that was built. So why is this episode considered such a turning point in the history of the city? And it's chiefly, I think, because of the way it changed the politics. The actual geography or physical layout of the city in the end didn't change much. Gastown, Chinatown were of course preserved, but the way politics was done changed significantly. First of all, a younger generation seemed to be challenging the values of the so-called establishment and demanding a voice in decisions. The debate over the freeway showed that the public was no longer willing to simply go along with what the experts advised. Essentially, there was a changing of the guard as the old backroom politics, where the planner and the property developer were king, was eroded by a new politics of participation and consultation. What this meant in practice, politically, was the decline of the nonpartisan association, the group that had more or less dominated city council since the association had formed in the 1930s. And at the same time, the emergence of a new political formation, the Electors' Action Movement, TEAM. TEAM was led by a group of reform-minded professionals, academics, lawyers, businessmen, who were mobilized by support for more open government in general. Teamsters believed that people directly affected by development projects should be consulted during the planning process. TEAM elected their first members to council in 1968, Art Phillips and Walter Hardwick, and then Phillips, pictured here in the middle of this photograph, won the mayoralty in 1972. But TEAM wasn't the only new political group in the city, and along with TEAM appeared a second, more radical group, the Committee of Progressive Electors, COPE. Unlike the middle-class TEAM, COPE was a socialist party with support from the labor movement. Its main voice on council was labor lawyer Harry Rankin. He was elected for the first time as an independent labor candidate in 1966, and he served on council until 1986, often topping the polls. In 86, he ran unsuccessfully for mayor against Gordon Campbell, but then he was back on council from 89 to 93. So he was certainly one of the longest serving aldermen in the city's history. At the same time, the freeway debate gave rise to activist community groups, which banded together to fight the proposal at the grassroots level. Most prominent, I suppose, was the Strathcona Property Owners and Tenants Association, SPOTA, and later the Downtown East Side Residents Association, DERA. SPOTA gave voice to neighborhood residents determined to save their homes and their businesses from the destructive urges of City Hall. DERA was formed a few years later in 1973 with a former logger and iron worker named Bruce Erickson as its first president. Along with community activist Jean Swanson and Libby Davies, Erickson and DERA advocated for the rights of the occupants of the rooming houses and fleabag hotels that characterized the inner city. Thanks to the efforts of DERA, the old Skid Road, also known as Central Hastings, was reimagined as the downtown East Side, which we know today, a community rather than an eyesore, whose residents demanded the same level of services as people in any other part of the city. The point is that civic politics, in the wake of the freeway debate, took a decided shift to the left. But that said, the extent of the change shouldn't be exaggerated. First of all, members of TEAM were not revolutionaries. They were moderate, middle-class reformers, many of them Liberal Party members, who gained most of their electoral support from the west side of the city. Art Phillips, who, as I say, was elected TEAM mayor in 1972, was an investment councillor. Other TEAM councillors were academics and lawyers. So in many ways, they represented a new elite, not a group of insurgents. And they actually didn't last very long. 2 years later, the TEAM presence on council was reduced to 5 aldermen, and the NPA was back up to 4. And by the end of the 70s, TEAM was reduced to a rump. Parenthetically, I want to mention my own favorite political moment from the 1970s, which was the 1974 election and the candidacy of Mr. Peanut. Mr. Peanut was an artist named Vincent Trassaw, who, in fact, I went to grade school with, who was associated with the Western Front, an artist-run center located in Mount Pleasant. He entered the contest to run for mayor in the costume of the Planters Peanut emblem, including, as you can see, the top hat, the monocle, the cane. He never spoke during the campaign. Someone else was the campaign spokesperson, and he did all the talking. But Mr. Peanut tap danced, and you can see here that he was supported at events by a group of musicians and a chorus line called the Peanettes. He managed in the 1974 election to gain 2,685 votes. Anyway, back to more serious matters. Despite the fact that they were quite short-lived, TEAM managed to make important changes to civic politics. One that I've hinted at was a much more consultative way of doing business. The old planner, Gerald Sutton Brown, was fired against the opinion, it must be said, of many people then and still today who thought his ouster was arbitrary and unwise. And processes were introduced that allowed people to have a much greater input into decisions that affected their neighborhoods. Another really important TEAM initiative that I want to mention is the transformation of False Creek, again seen here. Another neighborhood that was renewed during this period, just like the West End, the Coal Harbor, Strathcona. In the 60s, False Creek was still an industrial eyesore, as is evident from this photograph, and conventional thinking really expected it to remain that way, to remain the industrial center it had always been. Mayor Campbell and the NPA labeled as obstructionists and crackpots anyone who wanted to rid the creek of its industrial base. But a new vision for the area had emerged under the leadership of Walter Hardwick, TEAM councillor and urban geographer. Instead of the same old polluting industries, what emerged was the neighborhood that we have today, characterized by mixed incomes, low-rise family housing, and a substantial amount of open space. Construction of this new community began in 1975. At about the same time, the Fairview Slopes, south of False Creek, saw extensive redevelopment as many of the older homes which had characterized the neighborhood were replaced by modern condominium buildings. And I'll say a bit more about the condos in a moment. In both cases, planners preferred to adopt a low-rise approach to densification as opposed to the high-rise strategy familiar from the West End building boom a decade earlier. Along with the transformation of False Creek's South Shore came the rebirth of one of its prime industrial areas, Granville Island. This is what Granville Island looked like in 1917. As you can see from this picture, an aerial view dating from 1950, it became very crowded with industrial buildings in the interim. Thanks to the involvement of local MP and Liberal Cabinet Minister Ron Basford, jurisdiction over the island was transferred in 1973 from the Harbours Board to Central Mortgage and Housing, the federal agency responsible for housing. Under Basford's supervision, CMHC administered the transformation of Granville Island. One by one, resident industries gave up their leases, clearing the way for new tenants to move in, tenants who would conform to a new vision of the island as a kind of urban park with a variety of commercial, cultural, and recreational uses, highlighted by a large public market. Many of the old industrial buildings were recycled to conform to a new vision. For example, a haulage company's warehouse became a restaurant. Two old factories combined to provide a new home for the Emily Carr College, now University of Art and Design. These buildings in this photograph were converted into the public market. And then in 1979, the new island sprang to life. Just as Bayshore Inn and Cole Harbor before it, the rebirth of Granville Island and South False Creek generally signaled that the city was transitioning to a post-industrial economy, reliant on commerce, the arts, and technology and service industries. As also in Cole Harbor, the Granville Island project rescued a great chunk of the city's waterfront for public use. Finally, if we're going to talk about transformative developments in the city from the 1960s to the 70s, it's hard to overestimate the importance of the Strata Titles Act. This was an unassuming piece of provincial legislation passed by the legislature in 1966. It basically created the condominium, providing the legal framework to allow a single piece of property to be subdivided into units owned by different owners. And it ignited an explosion of condo construction and conversion in the 1970s until by 1980, there were 10,000 condos in the city. One area that was completely transformed was Fairview Slopes, which in the 60s was a neighborhood of older homes, as I mentioned earlier, most of them divided into apartments occupied by students, pensioners, other people who appreciated the affordable rents. Most of these homes came down in the subsequent decade, replaced by hundreds of modern strata units popular with middle-class professionals and empty nesters. The same trend was evident in Kitsilano, where 1,500 condo units were built between 1971 and 1976. Sometimes the rental units in older buildings were converted to strata ownership. And this is one personal example. Some of you will recognize this building, Killarney Manor on Point Grey Road near McDonald. My parents began renting in this building in 1971. And I suppose you'd call them empty nesters. A short time later, when the building was condominiumized, they were able to purchase their unit. And actually, members of my family have been living in this building ever since. Often, of course, the rental buildings were torn down and replaced by new condo buildings. In either case, many residents, unlike my parents, were not able to afford to buy units and lost their homes, which was the main negative effect of the whole condo phenomenon. This process of gentrification, sometimes eviction, did not happen without opposition from both tenant and community groups, but by and large, it was allowed to happen with minimal interference in the free market. And it really changed how Vancouverites lived. A few statistics. In 1961, about 3/4 of all dwelling units in the city were single-family homes. In 1986, just 25 years later, that number had fallen to barely over 50%, and by 1920, it was less than a third. Clearly, in the past half century, a profound change had occurred in the way people in the city house themselves. And a large part of that change has been the emergence of the condo. We often think that Expo 86 was the sort of uber event of modern Vancouver history, that the fair precipitated all kinds of profound changes in the city. The sudden influx of foreign capital into the housing market, the sudden escalation of housing prices, the ethnic diversification of the city's population, the emergence of the city as a world-class destination for travelers. Expo put Vancouver on the map, according to lots of fair enthusiasts, although I think it's fair to say that the city was on the map before 1986. But I guess what I wanted to point out tonight was that a real turning point in the city's history occurred long before Expo 86. It was actually in the late 60s and early 70s that the city was transforming itself, neighborhood by neighborhood, politically and economically and geographically. Politically, the old, cozy, unquestioned relationship between planners and developers and politicians was disrupted by insistent demands from neighborhood groups and the public generally to be involved in decision-making processes. In fact, you could see this new orientation reflected in the protests that were mounted against Expo itself, sometimes forgotten in the burst of excitement once the fair began. Economically, the deindustrialization of the civic economy was highlighted with the redevelopment of the former industrial areas like Cole Harbor and False Creek into residential and recreational areas. And geographically, a major change to the cityscape was the reclamation or the beginning of the reclamation of so much of the waterfront for public use, I suppose highlighted by the extension of the seawall. So that often when we consider the modern history of Vancouver, most of the focus is on Expo 86 and the enormous changes that were ushered in by the fair. But I hope I've illustrated that in fact, many of these changes were already underway and tracked back to the Great Freeway debate and developments that were changed, that were unleashed at least 2 decades before Expo. So I think I'll stop here, leave some time perhaps for your own reflections on post-50s civic redevelopment. Let me give one more plug for my book, Becoming Vancouver, available at bookstores everywhere. And thank you very much for tuning in.
You talk about the conflicting visions of what Vancouver is to become, and the Gerald Sutton Brown, Tom Campbell vision of it. Was there a parallel in that in an earlier Vancouver, say going back 100 years, or was there simply so much space 100 years ago, and really a place for everyone, even though everyone was in their place? If you catch that, can you comment on that, please?
Sure. No, it's one of the themes of the book, this tension between these two ideas of the city, and I think it goes back right to the beginning. An example I draw on in the book is the battle for Dead Man's Island, an incident where people were divided in the city over whether that island should be handed over to a logger and clear cut, or whether it was part of Stanley Park and should be preserved as a natural area. There were plans to develop the entrance to the Stanley Park in the 1920s, when a big shot planner was brought in and had great plans to turn Georgia Street into the Champs-Élysées of the West Coast. And he actually identified these two strains in the city, between those who who want to leverage the location and make it something grander, and those who prefer a pace of change that's much slower. So yes, this theme, I think, is evident all the way through the city's history.
How much do you think that we were saved by the fact that we're way out on the left coast? The Rocky Mountains is in the way. The freight rates made it very difficult for British Columbia and the Vancouver area to industrialize. Did we just get lucky? And I'm thinking of us vis-a-vis Seattle. Seattle or Portland is an example that got the freeways, that got the urban renewal. Toronto got the freeways or the urban renewal. Was it just that we were lucky that we were stuck out on the left and we didn't normally vote for the party in power federally?
Oh, I don't know. I hadn't thought of that. I would imagine that the people who mobilized, and you were perhaps among them, Michael, against the freeway, might be slightly offended to claim it was luck. I think a lot of work went into. I haven't to opposing some of the schemes. I haven't looked at the history of Seattle, so I don't know whether their big freeway that was pushed through, I think at about the same time, whether and what sort the opposition was and why it had less success. That would be an interesting comparative look. So
you talked very clearly about the belief in how experts were going to tell us how to live, and whether they were the planners who were going to redevelop, who were going to redevelop Strathcona, for example, or were going to give us a freeway, and that post-war idea that, well, it was know-how and it was experts who helped win the war, and therefore that carried forward into peacetime. And so my thought has always been that the cities who began to get urban renewal in the 1950s and the early 1960s, they got it before that kind of social justice movement and hippie movement and everything came to pass, and people began to organize against progress.
I'm not sure I catch a question.
It wasn't really a question,
no.
but I think it was more about, at what point did people begin to question experts?
Yeah, and that is an interesting question. In Vancouver, it seems to be that that was the tipping point. I don't want to suggest that somebody like Sutton Brown, for instance, was universally seen as some kind of dark figure, an evil genius behind all this. In fact, there's a contrary point of view that it was a big mistake to get rid of Sutton Brown, that many of the policies that we're living with today came out of that team era. Mm-hmm. But it's unquestionable that they introduced a shift in the political tone, the political processes at the time. How well you think that has played out for the city is a different matter.
Comments on, you talked about the deindustrialization of the central city, and that idea of these well-paying blue-collar jobs and the kind of city that it was. Can you compare that at all with where we are today?
Yes, well, I guess the conventional wisdom is they've all been replaced by, people working in high tech, and this is the new Vancouver economy. Certainly, it's during, my point is just that it's during that period that geographically, that as the economy shifted, the geographical layout, the landscape of the city was so prominently affected. So many of these neighborhoods that we take for granted today, like Falls Creek South and Cole Harbour, were the physical results of this economic process that that took place as businesses, industries abandoned for whatever reason the inner city areas and sought, I suppose, cheaper land on the outskirts and so on.
In the chat box, Zach Bennett, the book addresses so many of the major arcs and events in Vancouver's history as a city. What do you see as the most impactful things on the horizon today? This to me is what happens when you're a historian, is you get asked about the future.
Yeah, right.
So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I have thought about this a bit, and it seems to me two of the things, the most impactful things, are certainly the redevelopment down in the flats, the railway flats, where the new hospital is going to be located, and what will occur to that whole neighborhood if we keep to this theme that I established of changing neighborhoods. And I think the other thing is the reemergence or the emergence of the First Nations people as property developers, and these large developments with Indigenous involvement at the end of Broad Street Bridge and out in Jericho, the Jericho lands, and the other one further to the south towards the Oak Ridge area. I mean, these are massive developments, so that so much of the development in the city over the next 20 to 30 years will be with Indigenous involvement. So these, to me, are the two interesting. Oh, and a third one would be what's going to happen in False Creek South, eh? That's a real something that I will be watching.
On the flats. Yeah, on the False Creek Flats.
No, I mean the False Creek South development, and now that the leases are coming due, and what the city's plans are for it, and there's going to be a lot of discussion about that area. Because it was such a pioneering neighborhood, wasn't it? And now it's up for discussion.